Welcome to Friends Online. Today, we're going to do things differently because we got to talk. So Russia's at war with Ukraine. Russia has invaded Ukraine. And I was studying for this message for Friends Online, and I was studying out of Joshua chapter 6. And if you've read that book of the Bible, when you get to chapter 6, you'll see that God commands his people to invade another people group. So you can imagine how uncomfortable I became. And to be honest, I didn't quite know how to answer it. So today what we're going to do is we're going to peek in on a conversation that discusses this very question. So Aaron Opog has a podcast called The Resilient Christian. And what they do is they have really authentic conversation around tough issues like this. Because he's seen people that have just recently come to faith fall away from their faith because of things like this, because of difficulties in the Bible like this. And we've also seen a lot of people that have been Christians for a long time start to deconstruct their faith because of tough issues like this. So Aaron reached out to a Old Testament professor of biblical studies who his area of study is on violence in the Old Testament. And they bring up this very subject. And so what we're going to do for this episode of Friends Online is we're going to peek into their conversation. And we're going to watch about 25 minutes of a 40-minute conversation. And if you stick with me to the end, I'm going to pop back in and give you a couple more resources if you want to continue diving into this question. So let's listen in.
I think it's always really good for us as Christians to wrestle with the mysteries of the Scripture, and we as a church and as a podcast believe in the inspiration of the Scriptures, and we want to wrestle with these texts well and figure out how do we make sense of them all. Sure. Looking more into the New Testament now, we are told in the Bible, I believe it's in Romans, to not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil by good. What does the Bible say about overcoming evil practically, even in light of some of these texts in the Old Testament?
Sure. When I begin my class, I teach a class on violence in the Old Testament. I start out by saying, this semester, we're going to spend a lot of time looking closely at a few texts that are very negative. There's much more to the Old Testament than these violent texts. And as though we've already pointed out that the New Testament predominantly looks a lot different. So if we focus too much on a certain issue or these kind of negative texts, that's all we see, and that can be kind of overwhelming and put a negative taste in our mouth about the Bible. But there's much more to it than that. Yeah. I'm an Old Testament professor, so I was thinking about this through the portion of the Bible that I tend to read. I think Genesis 12, God's promise to Abram, that first blessing, I will bless you, and through you all nations on earth will be blessed. This blessing, this choice of Abraham and his family is for the purpose of blessing everyone. John Goldingay says that this shows that God is primarily about blessing, not primarily about violence and cursing. I think that's a really helpful distinction. Yeah. The beginning of the nation of Israel, this family that turned into nation, is where God begins, and this is for the purpose of blessing. There are a number of anti-war and texts that condemn war in the Old Testament. Isaiah 30, 31, salvation is in peace and rest. Israel is to trust in God, not in the horses. War is not an ideal or a goal. It is certainly more a part of life in the ancient Near East than it is for us today. But even then, they knew that they wanted something else. A number of prophecies, prophecies that look to a time past judgment. So prophets often, almost always spoke a word of judgment. But oftentimes they would talk about a time after judgment. And that time after judgment was almost always anti-war and pro-peace. So Isaiah 9, that's the Emmanuel prophecy. It's the destruction of symbols and tools of war. The final title for that figure is Prince of Peace. Isaiah 11, this figure is going to destroy injustice with words rather than with weapons. The infant's going to play with the cobra. Micah 5, the ruler's going to come to shepherd and be peace. So I think that when Israel thought about the ideal world, it was a world of peace. And so I think that that's really helpful, because we can look at the Old Testament and think, okay, this is a lot of violent judgment, but the reality was they pictured and longed for peace.
And that'll preach. In fact, I preached a little bit on shalom this past weekend at our church. And just that one of the major themes of the Bible could be summarized as shalom, as God wanting to bring peace between us and God, us and each other, and us and within ourselves. Sure. And I think what you're describing is that idea of shalom, and God really longs for peace that's not about violence or war. That is such a beautiful picture of the heart of God, in all of this. Last question, and then we'll let you go. I know you're a busy man. If someone asked you, why would a good God command his people to invade and destroy another nation, and you only had 2 minutes, like you're in an elevator with somebody who's a skeptic to all of this, and they find out you're an Old Testament professor, what do you say in like those 2 minutes?
Sure. I think that, as you mentioned, inspiration of Scripture is important, but the authority of Scripture involves understanding how to read and correctly understand it. So at first glance, it might appear that God commands Israel to invade and destroy. Not all biblical texts describe Israel's origins this way. Archaeology and a deeper reading of the Bible give us a different picture altogether. So texts in Deuteronomy and Joshua do describe this, but different texts in Joshua and Judges offer that contrasting picture. If we pay attention to issues of genre, compositional history, cultural components, the ideology of biblical authors, this shows us that these texts were written generations after the events that they narrate. They were written using forms of military speech that were common at that time, and they were used for purposes other than a strict recounting of history. If we approach them expecting history, we're imposing our desire on it rather than looking for what it's trying to do. If we look at what these texts are trying to do, their cultural memory. They're used by the authors of scriptures to teach and highlight important truths such as obedience, the danger of apostasy, Israel's need for religious purity, Yahweh's promise to give them the land. This is what Israel's doing with those texts, and that's what we should pay attention to. So when we read these texts, look at how Israel used them, seek to translate that into our own setting. So we might reflect on faithful worship practices and attitudes, the perpetual importance even today of obedience and the never-ending faithfulness of God. But I would certainly say that we should reject the idea that God commanded the wholesale slaughter of entire peoples. That should not be the reality that's not a reality that should inform our actions or our theology.
That's good. Blair, thank you so much for your time. I know you're busy teaching, and this has been so helpful for us to make sense of these passages. Thank you for spending years studying these things. And remind us of the book again that you read on a war. You threw it out there. You said it's really good reading. Remind us of that so I can put it in the show notes for people.
Sure. Eric Seibert's a great author on this. He's got 3 books on it. His book, Disturbing Divine Behavior, is kind of an overview. Yeah. He talks about a couple different theories as well as proposes how to read the text. And then one of his more recent books, Disarming the Church, is about how to live peacefully. So how do we act nonviolently in our family, with our neighbors, as government? What does it mean to be a disciple of Christ nonviolently? Both very good
wonderful
books.
Great. Well, thank you again, Blair, for your time. Thanks for being on the show, and God bless you, and we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Thanks, Aaron.